According to John Lindemann, who wrote an incredible book called Mastering the Australian Housing Market, which was published back in 2010, Australian residential property in the 100 years leading up to that published date had averaged over 11% per annum, making it one of the top performing assets in the world over the last 100 years. On top of this, according to Simon Presley, between 1972 and 2002, Australian residential property went up on average by 8.2% per annum. Now, these returns would be extremely special if we weren't talking about leverage. But if you're talking about adding leverage to this, these are some of the strongest returns that investors anywhere in the world have received at any point in the last 50 to 100 years. Now, I recently stumbled across an incredible article that was put together by CoreLogic, now Cotality. Now, in that 30-year period between 1992 and 2022, they went and looked at what Australia's capital cities had done over that period of time. Now, during that period, the average house in Sydney went up by over 507%. In Melbourne, house prices went up on average by 519%, making it Australia's top performing market over that 30-year period. While in Brisbane, house prices went up an incredible 389% and over 320% over there in Perth. Now, the reason the history and the data is so important to investors like yourself and my family is because it helps aid us making better decisions moving forward. Not only can we use this information to find the right markets at the right time of their cycle, but as the bumps and bruises invariably come in the marketplace, we know that the bad times do not last forever. Now, I recently sat down with Akhil Patel, who wrote The Secret Wealth Advantage, and his business partner, Phil Anderson, who wrote The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking. And when I was with them, we looked at the last 60 years worth of data or the last 3 20-year real estate cycles. Now, these cycles are based on a period of about 14 years up and about 4 years down. Now, when we looked at the history during those periods of markets like the GFC or the Great Depression, which are those scary times in the market cycle, what they found is that property prices have only actually gone down by 8% in Sydney and Melbourne on average, and 12% in Brisbane and Perth on average during some of the worst economic environments that we've seen in Australia in the last 60 years. Now, what was even more interesting to me as an investor when I looked at Simon Presley's work was in that 50-year period between 1972 and 2022, there was actually only 1 year in that 50-year period where property prices in every capital city in Australia went down in the same year at the same time. Now, why that's so important to you as an investor at this stage of the cycle and at this time right now is that Australia is not one massive collective market. In fact, it is made up of 8 metro markets that have done extremely well historically, as well as hundreds, if not thousands, of regional and micro markets around the country. So over here at Pumped on Property on a weekly basis, we actually analyze the 19 largest markets in Australia and over 40,087 suburbs each week. Now, when I look at each of these suburbs, which have around about 15 key performance indicators each, it means that we're analyzing over 65,392 data points on a weekly basis. Now, when I overlay that with some of the information that we did late last year, and I look at the 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 7 year, 10 year, and 18 year performance of all of the best markets in the country, we start to see patterns and holes in the market that other people don't see because they can't collectively review that data in real time. Now, obviously, I could go so far down the wormhole here and completely bore you guys to death, but I really wanted to look at Sydney versus Melbourne versus Brisbane versus Perth, and hopefully show you some of the massive holes in some of these markets right now and the psychology of the investors that we're competing against on a weekly basis so that you can make the best possible decisions moving forward from today. Now, if we start with Sydney, over the last 30 years ending in 2022, we know that house prices went up on average by 507%. And then on top of this, if we take a step back and we look at the 18-year period starting just before the last GFC in 2007, according to H-Tag, property prices in Sydney have gone up by over 267% in the current cycle. Then if we take a step further back from there, in the last 10 years, house prices in Sydney have done 70% growth. And in the last 7 years, they've done about 61%. Now, all of this information is extremely abstract until I tie it in a nice bow for you in a moment and I look at the different markets against each other. Now, if we go into Melbourne in the 30 years leading up to 2022, house prices went up by over 519%. Now, Melbourne also kicked ass in the last 18 years, going up by 215%. But here's where Melbourne's story starts to get more interesting. In the last 10 years, Melbourne only did 58%. And in the last 7 years, Melbourne averaged 25%. Now, why that's important when comparing those two markets is they both had an incredible 30 years, an incredible 18 years, but Melbourne has done almost nothing in comparison to Sydney over the last 7. When we look at Brisbane, just to create some more contrast here or another comparison, in the last 30 years ending in 2022, Brisbane did about 389% growth. Now again, in the 18-year period, the bigger picture, Brisbane also kicked ass, going up by over 235% during that time. But here's where Brizzy gets interesting. In the last 10 years, it's done over 126% growth. And in the last 7 years, it's done over 100% growth. Now, when I start to compare Brisbane, for example, versus Melbourne, if I'm an investor going into the market in 2026 and beyond, I can see that Melbourne over the last 7 years has done 77% less growth than Brisbane. But when comparing Brisbane versus Melbourne over a 30-year period, Melbourne has done 130% better than Brisbane. Now, these are the edges that the data and understanding your history can give you as an investor. Instead of rushing into the likes of Adelaide, Perth or Darwin this year, like so many people will, chasing short-term returns and the markets that have done well recently, you can take a bigger picture perspective and go, Melbourne has actually smashed the long-term performance of many of these markets, and over time things will begin to readjust, and the markets that have done well recently will be the ones that do poorly over time, and the ones that have done really poorly recently will be the ones that smash it over the next 10 years. Now, if we look at Perth, which is extremely hot at the moment, in fact, at the time of recording this video, it had done over 15% in the last year. It's expected to do over 15% this year, and it was going up over 2% per month. But Perth in the last 30 years, ending in 2022, did about 324% growth. In the last 18 years, Perth has had an incredible ride. It has gone obviously absolutely ballistic in the last 5 to 7, but in the 10 years before that, it took an absolute bath after the last GFC, which means its 18-year growth rate is sitting at just 117% at the time of recording this video. If I was looking at that one number in isolation, which is a massive trap that so many investors get in, going, well, Perth in the last 18 years has only done 117% growth. It must be massively undervalued versus Melbourne's 215%, Brisbane's 235%, or Sydney's 267%, I'm going to go and chase that market because it looks statistically down on that one number. But this is why having a large sample size of different years and different timeframes as an investor is so powerful. If we look at Perth over the last 7 years, it's gone up by almost 100% growth. And in the last 5 years alone, it's done 87%. So sometimes the longer term picture versus the short-term picture don't tell the same story. And if you're chasing one number at the expense of another, you might accidentally run into trouble. Now, why this is so compelling to me when I look at particularly the Sydney versus Melbourne versus Brisbane versus Perth scenario, in the last 5 years, Sydney has done 42% growth, Melbourne has done 16.5% growth, Queensland has done 82% growth, and Perth has done 87% growth. So when I look at these capital cities and I go, okay, everyone in Australia is rushing into Perth or Brisbane at the moment for good reason. They've kicked ass recently. There's strong expectation for price growth to continue in these two markets short term. But I look at Perth, for example, versus Melbourne, and in the last 5 years alone, Perth has grown 70% more than Melbourne, which means Melbourne in the last 5 years has done 70% less growth than Perth. Now, as investors, our job is always to look at the Australian market as a whole and then try and make the best possible investment decisions we can based on the history and the data that we have access to at the time. Now, most people that you know and that I know will just blindly follow the crowd into whichever market is cranking this month, last year, or in the last 5 years, because who doesn't love to tell their friend about the property they bought in Perth for $500,000 in 2020 that now in 2026 is worth over $1 million, and people go, well, I want to make 500K out of thin air. I guess I'm going to go over there because that's the place that's doing it right now. But if you can step back and use history and data to drive your decisions and you go, that's all well and good, Perth has absolutely kicked ass. I might have missed that boat, but I'm not going to miss the next boat, which could be Melbourne, Bendigo, Ballarat, the Mornington Peninsula, Geelong, or some of the more undervalued properties and suburbs in New South Wales as well as Queensland, you can still set yourself up for phenomenally good returns over the next 5 to 15 years. Now, the reason I got so obsessed with all of this property history and property data was because I made so many mistakes for myself as an investor over my journey. When I started to buy at the age of 24 in Sydney in 2011, I literally had no idea of history. I had no idea about what to look for as an investor, and I just bought properties based on what was close to my home. But as my knowledge, experience, and education as an investor grew, and I went from 0 to 20 properties over a 16-year period of time, I realized that you can take one of two approaches to investing. You can go, I'm going to buy and that's good enough and hope that over the longer term, history continues to repeat. Or you can go for great and follow fundamentals and the lessons to squeeze that extra couple of % per year off an investment property. So an example of this is, let's say you went out there this year and bought a $1 million property, and you held that property for the next 15 years and it went up by just 5% per annum. In 15 years time, the value of that property could be as much as $2,078,000. Now that's a phenomenal return. You've obviously doubled your money over that period of time. And if you've taken leverage, you've absolutely knocked it out of the park. And that is an okay outcome that almost any investor that buys a capital city or a major regional market in Australia will achieve over the next 15 years based on history. But let's say you, like me, want more this year and you want more out of every investment that you do from here on out. But instead of following what the crowd does, we follow investment fundamentals and absolutely nail every single one of the key performance indicators and lessons from history for the property that we buy. And so in this example, that $1 million property that we hold for the next 15 years goes up by 7% per annum, or an extra 2% by following the rules of the past. That same value property in 15 years could be worth as much as $2,759,000, which is over a $680,000 difference for you and your family just by following world's best practice on this next investment. And that's the reason I'm so OCD on helping my clients and helping my family make the best decisions possible. What I truly want is a small amount of passive income for life, the highest quality properties that I can possibly hold, and with every decision I make moving forward, making sure it's the right one backed on fundamentals. Now, one of my favorite things as a person in 2026 and beyond is there's just such incredibly good quality information out there on the podcasts, the forums, the blogs, through AI and through YouTube. And all of this online stuff is fantastic. But there are also some incredible books out there that I highly recommend you go and read this year. Now, the first one of them is The Secret Wealth Advantage by Akhil Patel. And what this book is based on is the same 250 years worth of data that the great Phil Anderson, who wrote The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking, was looking at. And that is the 18.6 year real estate cycle. Now, if you haven't already come across this one, I highly recommend adding it to your reading list this year. It will not just give you a pragmatic view of history and many, many lessons that you can use to make better decisions moving forward, but it will give you an incredible guide and different lessons that you can apply at different stages of the coming real estate cycle in the likes of property, stocks, gold and silver, businesses, and when to leverage up on your portfolio, as well as when to take a bit of a back seat and relax and just allow things to unfold in front of you. Another book that's completely changed my life, which I'm sorry I've ripped the cover off, is called The Power in the Land. Now, this one was written by a UK economist called Fred Harrison. He also published another incredible book called Boom Bust. Now, what's so impressive and important about Fred is he was the one that originally discovered this 18.6 year real estate cycle based on an analysis of 350 years of booms and busts in the UK. Now, what's incredible about Fred is that this book was published in 1983, calling the 1990 recession. Now, what's even more crazy is Fred Harrison's book, Boom Bust, which was published as early as 1999, predicted the 2010 global financial crisis, with republications in 2005 and 2007 predicting the GFC years in advance. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about is a book called The Way Ahead to Property Wealth. Now, my grandma actually gave this to me before she passed away, and there was a little note in there from my grandpa. Now, the note said, I've just purchased my first home on the northern beaches in DY of Sydney for just over $2,000. Look at my wages as a surveyor, it's going to take me 37 years to pay off this property. Now that property today would be worth over $2 million just 50 years later. Now in the preface of this book, or the start of this book, it says the 1974 recession has had a profound effect on the personal attitudes and ambitions of all people in the community and has thrown into doubt the scope and opportunity for accumulating personal wealth. Many traditional areas of saving and investing have been affected by the inflation and recession of recent years, that they are no longer thought of with the same respect and regard as they were. With the worst of the recession now over and with the recovery in the making, we believe it's timely to expose the old principles that are no longer relevant in this inflationary economy and to restate the principles that remain valid. It is perhaps unfortunate that it has taken the worst recession in 40 years to highlight faculties and truths about investment. This is just crazy. This book is all about real estate investment, and we make no excuse for that because we still believe, as we always have done, that ownership of real estate is not only the best way and the safest way to wealth, but it is the only way. Now, this book was published 48 years ago, and I can guarantee almost no Australians have read it. Now, I can also guarantee that people coming out of that 1970s recession would have felt horribly about real estate. But when we take a step back and go, despite COVID, the GFC, and all of the horrible times like 9/11, the dot-com boom and bust, the 1980s recession, the Cuban Missile Crises, all of the wars, all of the horrible things that have happened globally, that real estate in Australia, according to John Lindeman, up to the time of publishing his book, has still done 11% per annum, is why I believe it's so important to take away the misinformation here, to look at what markets are actually doing and to make the best decisions that we can as investors. Now, if you, like me, are seriously considering buying an investment property in the next 3 to 12 months, then I would love to personally offer you a one-on-one strategy session. To book that session, all you have to do is go over to www.pumpedonproperty.com, click that free strategy session button, and we can talk about where you are right now, where you'd like to be longer term. We can talk about the history of the Australian property market and the most undervalued markets in Australia. And you can take that information and go and absolutely knock it out of the park on your own, or potentially become one of the extremely small number of clients that we choose to take on each week. But either way, I truly wish you all the best, and I hope, like me, you can learn from history and make the best decisions possible for your family moving forward.